Hello, my favorite subscribers. Today we have another exciting and interesting revenge story. Enjoy the show! Legacy of Lies Chapter 1, The Shattered Inheritance. The morning sun beamed through the ornate windows of the Morrow family estate, casting a glow on the family portraits lining the grand hallway. Catherine Morrow, with her poised demeanor and eyes reflecting years of discipline, stood as a pillar amidst the chaos that surrounded her. The reading of her father's last will and testament had gathered an eclectic array of distant relatives and eager opportunists, all pretending to mourn. Catherine had anticipated this day with a mix of dread and obligation, knowing it would officially mark her as the matriarch of Morrow Industries. What she hadn't anticipated was the sharp turn of fate that would be read out in her father's lawyer's steady voice. To Catherine, I leave nothing. The words hung in the air, an unfathomable sentence that made her question her own ears. Her stepmother, Marlene, draped in black, feigned a sorrowful countenance. Yet, there was a flicker in her eyes, a gleam of victory that belied her somber guise. As Catherine stood, rooted to the spot by shock, whispers began to burgeon around her, each syllable a hammer to her poise. Marlene approached, her voice honeyed with feigned sympathy. Darling, I'm as shocked as you are. But your father had his reasons, I'm sure. Catherine searched the faces in the room, her upbringing forbidding her to lash out in public. But behind her measured gaze, a storm began to brew. In the weeks that followed, Catherine's life became a series of whispers and closed doors. Old friends of the family looked through her, and the board members of Morrow Industries, once allies, turned their backs. The grand house, once her sanctuary, felt like a maze designed to trap her at every turn. But Catherine was her father's daughter, a woman who had learned to play chess with executives twice her age and win. It was during a restless night, as she paced the floors of her now confined quarters, that a single memory pierced the fog of her predicament. Years back, she had stumbled upon her father in his study, a rare moment of weakness in his eyes as he argued with Marlene. I won't let you do this, Marlene. This company is not just mine, it's Catherine's legacy. The memory was a spark, the first real glimmer of hope. If Marlene had pressured her father, there had to be proof. And Catherine Morrow was determined to find it. With the dawn came a resolve. Her stepmother had laid the foundation of a lie, but Catherine would tear it down, brick by brick. Chapter 2, Gathering the Shadows. Catherine's mind raced with the implications of her father's words from the past. They were a beacon in the murky waters she now navigated, suggesting that her father's intentions for her had been different from the will's decrees. But to contest the will, she needed irrefutable evidence, something that could unravel Marlene's scheme. In the subdued light of her study, Catherine pored over old documents, her father's ledgers, and every piece of correspondence she could discreetly acquire. She realized her greatest asset was her invisibility. In being written off, she was underestimated, a shadow in the vast halls of her former home. Realizing she couldn't do this alone, Catherine reached out to old allies who had been more than employees, they had been part of the Morrow legacy. Her father's old secretary, Mrs. Winters, was the first to join her cause. Loyal to the marrow and sharp as a tack, Mrs. Winters brought with her old files some seemingly innocuous letters and receipts that had been carefully archived. Another unexpected ally was Thomas, the family chauffeur, whose respect for her father had extended to Catherine. He became her eyes and ears, relaying who Marlene met with and when. His unassuming presence allowed him to blend into the background, gathering pieces of overheard conversations and rumors spreading through the staff. Catherine's once socialite evenings transformed into strategy meetings with her small but growing coalition. They pieced together a timeline of Marlene's integration into Morrow Industries and her father's life. Whispers turned into tangible theories when Mrs. Winters recalled a peculiar incident, an argument about a document her father had refused to sign, despite Marlene's insistence. Piece by piece, a picture began to form of Marlene's manipulation. A hefty transaction to an unknown account flagged by an audit years ago, an alteration in company bylaws, and the most damning piece of all, drafts of a will that predated the one read after her father's death, leaving the company to Catherine. The chapter closed with Catherine's hands steadying on the last piece of the puzzle, a document misplaced in a mislabeled file, one that could very well be the key to exposing Marlene's machinations. Her heart raced. The game of shadows was about to take a turn into the light. Chapter 3: The Architect of Revenge. Under the cloak of night, Catherine and her clandestine crew worked tirelessly, their every move a calculated step towards Marlene's undoing. The misplaced document proved to be a forged power of attorney that granted Marlene undue influence over her father's affairs. Armed with this, Catherine knew they could cast doubt on the authenticity of the will, but it wasn't enough. They needed concrete evidence that could not be refuted. Catherine constructed a plan to obtain Marlene's private financial records. It was a daring and legally gray strategy that would involve infiltrating the very heart of Morrow Industries. It was a risk, but one that Catherine was willing to take. Thomas, the chauffeur, with his unremarkable appearance and unerring loyalty, was tasked with the crucial role of infiltrating the company's secure files. With Mrs. Winter's inside knowledge of company operations and schedule, he knew exactly when the offices would be empty. Disguised as a janitor, his after-hours cleaning pass became the ticket to the locked file room where the records were kept. Meanwhile, Catherine used her social standing to reconnect with industry allies, subtly extracting information over quiet lunches and hushed phone calls. She was a vision of grace and resilience, each interaction a measured step towards her goal. The stolen moments of subterfuge bore fruit one evening when Thomas emerged from the Morrow building with a flash drive concealed within his jacket. It contained Marlene's financial records, proof of her extravagant purchases that aligned suspiciously with missing funds from the company's accounts. The evidence was compelling, but not yet conclusive. It was the conversation Mrs. Winters overheard while posing as a consultant that provided the missing link. Marlene had been reckless, confiding in an old friend about her control over her late husband's assets and her role in the manipulation of his final testament. Gathering their collective findings, Catherine orchestrated a series of anonymous leaks to the press and key figures within Morrow Industries. It was a strategic dispersal of information that would not trace back to her but would create an unstoppable momentum of scrutiny upon Marlene. As the sun rose, marking the end of their nocturnal plotting, Catherine knew that the stage was set. Her father's company would soon be besieged by questions and investigations. She had laid out her traps with meticulous care, and it was only a matter of time before Marlene stepped right into them. The chapter concluded with Catherine, a silent sentinel, watching the sunrise. She was not the same woman who had been shocked by betrayal weeks ago. She was now the architect of her stepmother's impending downfall, and with the dawn, the first strike of her meticulously planned revenge would begin to unfold. Chapter 4: The Web of Deceit. The morning light spilled into the boardroom of Morrow Industries, where whispers had already begun to circulate like a foreboding wind. The leaks had taken effect, setting the gears of gossip and speculation into overdrive. As the executives gathered, their side conversations were tinged with the anxiety of the unknown, a stark contrast to the confident facade Marlene attempted to maintain at the head of the table. Catherine, once the heart of these assemblies, now observed from the sidelines under the guise of indifference. She watched as Marlene's composure faltered with each ding of a new email notification, each carrying the weight of evidence that chipped away at the fortress of lies she had built. As the leaks continued to permeate through the media and the company, the board members of Morrow Industries faced mounting pressure. Journalists began connecting the dots between Marlene's lavish lifestyle and the company's inexplicable financial discrepancies. The web that Marlene had so intricately woven around her was beginning to constrict. But Catherine knew that the public's perception was only one battlefield. She needed to sway the company's loyalty away from Marlene. To do this, she met quietly with influential board members, providing them with the unassailable truth of Marlene's misdeeds, and with it, the promise of Morrow Industries' return to integrity and prosperity under rightful leadership. As Catherine orchestrated these clandestine meetings, her stepmother's empire began to unravel. The board demanded an emergency audit, and the authorities took a keen interest in the discrepancies uncovered by the media frenzy. The regulators began to ask uncomfortable questions, ones that Marlene couldn't charm or manipulate her way out of. The night before the audit was to commence, Catherine's once insurmountable calm gave way to a restless anticipation. Tomorrow would be the day her father's legacy would be reclaimed, and justice would be served. She found herself in her father's study, amidst his legacy, the place where he had taught her that integrity and determination were the keystones of their family. The chapter closed on the eve of Marlene's exposure, with Catherine sitting in her father's chair, feeling the weight and warmth of impending vindication. She whispered a promise into the silence, to both her father and herself, that the dawn would bring with it the restoration of her name and the downfall of the legacy of lies. Chapter 5, The Legacy Restored. The morning of the audit was greeted by a tempest of activity at Morrow Industries. The air was thick with tension as investigators descended upon the offices, rifling through files and computers, sealing rooms, and taking statements. News vans and reporters jostled for positions outside, the story having exploded into a national scandal. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Catherine sat with dignified poise, the calm epicenter in a storm of legal proceedings. Marlene's carefully curated image unraveled as evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and the manipulation of her late husband's will was laid bare before the court. Catherine watched as the stepmother she once knew as family was reduced to a defendant in the stand, scrambling under the weight of her own deceit. As the trial progressed, Marlene's defenses crumbled. Key testimony from Mrs. Winters and corroborating evidence from Thomas painted a clear picture of the manipulation that had ousted Catherine from her rightful inheritance. The jury's eyes were often on Catherine, whose composure and quiet strength seemed to contrast with Marlene's increasing desperation. Marlene's web of lies, once so formidable, proved to be her undoing. The jury saw through the facade, and the gavel fell with a weight that echoed through the silent courtroom. Guilty. The word was a balm to Catherine's years of being manipulated and scorned. Marlene was sentenced, her future a stark corridor of penance for the greed and betrayal she had sown. In the wake of the trial, Catherine returned to Morrow Industries, not as an outcast, but as the leader it needed. With the board's support, she stepped into the role of CEO, her first act being to address the company's employees. Her speech was not one of vengeance fulfilled, but of hope, unity, and the enduring legacy her father had instilled in the company's foundations. In the days that followed, Catherine worked tirelessly to restore the company's reputation. She implemented new checks and balances, ensuring that the corruption Marlene had introduced would never plague Morrow Industries again. Catherine also established a charitable foundation in her father's name, dedicated to ethical business practices and transparency. The final chapter drew to a close with Catherine standing in the Morrow Estate's grand hallway, her gaze lingering on her father's portrait. The home that once echoed with betrayal was now the cornerstone of a new era. A legacy of lies had been dismantled, and in its place stood a future built on truth and the unyielding resolve of Catherine Morrow.